Hello, I'm Nadia Sharby. Thank you for joining us for this new edition of France in Focus. Here's what we have lined up for you this week. It's a rare honour to be inducted to the Pantheon mausoleum, rarer still for women, which made Wednesday's ceremony historic in more ways than one. The Eiffel Tower is France's most iconic landmark, but it also provides rich pickings for petty criminals, much to the annoyance of the monument's staff. And if you thought you knew everything about the French Tennis Open, stay tuned as we answer the ultimate quiz question on Roland Garros. I'm standing here in front of the Pantheon Mausoleum, a monument that for the French is synonymous with greatness and achievement. It's the president who gets to decide who is laid here to rest, often symbolically, as a sort of republican canonization. Now, among the dignitaries you'll find here are Voltaire, Victor Hugo or Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, over 70 luminaries, and among them, just the one woman rewarded for her work, that scientist Marie Curie. But that wrong began to be righted this week when François Hollande added 4 names to the list, among them 2 women. All 4 were chosen for having resisted Nazi occupation during the Second World War, a spirit that the president likened to that went through France after the January Paris attacks, a spirit of unity that he describes here.
70 years on, this hatred re-emerges, bearing different faces and under different circumstances, but always with the same words and the same intentions. The French stood together on January 11th to counter this deadly resurgence because they're never afraid of defending their freedom.
Well, let's take a closer look now at the Pantheon's newest members.
4 leading figures of the French resistance, 2 women, 2 men. Pierre Brossolette, a leftist and pacifist, was a journalist in the 1930s. At the start of the war, he went into hiding and made his way to London, where he met General Charles de Gaulle in 1942.
The only distinction now is resistance with General de Gaulle or collaborator with Pétain and Laval.
Brossolette was arrested and tortured by the Gestapo in March 1944, and to prevent himself from talking, he jumped out a window. The 6th of June 1936, at 32 years old, Jean Zay was the youngest person to join the government. He was the education minister and was regarded as a visionary. His ideas gave birth to ENA, France's top political school, and the Cannes Film Festival. A Freemason and Jew, he was murdered by pro-Nazi French militiamen in 1944. In June 1940, as France fell into Nazi hands, 20-year-old Geneviève de Gaulle Antonio, Charles de Gaulle's niece, joined the resistance. Arrested and tried in 1943, she was then deported to Ravensbrück in Germany. When the war ended, she began a different fight, this time against poverty, heading a human rights organization for 30 years.
It's a sense of misery, a sense of misery that we can never forget. That's what we witnessed at Ravensbrück.
It was at the women's concentration camp in Ravensbrück where Germaine Tillion ended up as well. This professional ethnologist became a resistance fighter, taking to the pen at the end of the war.
For me, it was very important to tell the truth. I was anxious to report the truth.
The parts of these 2 women have now placed them among France's most illustrious.
This Thursday, David Cameron was in Paris as part of a whistle-stop tour aimed at renegotiating Britain's relations with Europe. As part of his campaign, the freshly re-elected Prime Minister has vowed to stage an in-out referendum on Europe, much to the chagrin of the bloc's founding members, first of them, France. So where does that leave relations between the 2 countries? Let's take a look.
Stepping into the Élysée Palace, David Cameron knows he's on shaky territory. He has between now and 2017 to renegotiate Britain's place in the EU. One problem though, Paris and Berlin have just announced plans for greater EU integration, economically, financially and socially. A snub to Cameron, who's announced he will hold an in-out referendum in Britain on EU membership.
My priority is to reform the European Union to make it more competitive and to address the concerns of the British people about our membership. The status quo is not good enough.
La France
France wants Great Britain to stay in the EU. There'll be a referendum. It's been announced. And it will be for the British people to decide what they want. We think that it's in the interest of Europe and of Britain to stay together.
But staying together has been a challenge for the leaders so far. François Hollande came to Britain during his presidential campaign in 2012, but Cameron refused to meet with him. The presidential candidate had to make do with engagements with the Labour leader Ed Miliband and French expatriates. The two finally met for the first time before the G8 summit at Camp David. A few months later, they were at loggerheads. The reason? Taxes on the rich. Socialist Hollande had just been elected. He wanted to make good on a promise to create a 75% tax for those who earned more than €1 million a year. For the right-wing Cameron, this was absurd.
If the French go ahead with a 75% top rate of tax, we will roll out the red carpet and welcome more French businesses to Britain, and they can pay taxes in Britain, and that can pay for our health service and our schools and everything else.
It was over money too that David Cameron called a halt to an EU meeting in October. He refused to pay a €2 billion bill presented to him by EU bureaucrats. Cameron was furious, but across the channel he got a cool reception.
I don't know how David Cameron will get his hands on that money, but I know what I will do. Nothing to help him pay. Treaties must be respected, they apply to everyone.
A view shared by Hollande's German partner. Paris and Berlin are the economic and diplomatic motors of Europe. The latest example, peace negotiations in Minsk. Accompanied by Angela Merkel, it was François Hollande who worked on a peace accord between Russia and Ukraine. Britain was not consulted. France and Germany are now more united economically than ever. Berlin is Paris's #1 trading partner and vice versa. But this did not stop Britain from overtaking France last January as the 5th strongest economy in the world.
As president, his critics nicknamed him Sarko the American. But as Nicolas Sarkozy pushes to rebrand his UMP party as Les Républicains, or the Republicans, it's not the transatlantic nod that irks his opponents, rather what some see as a hijacking of the founding notion of the French Republic. After an attempt to block the name change failed in court, it's now up to the party's members to vote on the issue. It's known as offering the best view in Paris, but last week unlucky holidaymakers were left staring up at the very landmark they travelled far and wide to visit. The Eiffel Tower was closed for business. Staff were on strike. Not, in fact, the cliché you might imagine. What workers were doing is trying to draw attention to a rise in crime around the monument. Tourists make easy marks for well-organised pickpockets who flock to the area.
If you're holidaying in Paris, there's one site that's a must. The Iron Lady's one of the biggest tourist attractions in France, but visitors were sorely disappointed last week when they tried to gain access to the Eiffel Tower.
We have limited time, pretty disappointed that the thing's not open.
Staff at the Eiffel Tower staged a walkout in protest against the level of petty crime surrounding the monument. Illegal vendors are often chased away by the police, and aggressive pickpocketing and extortion schemes plague these tourist-heavy areas of Paris, leaving visitors increasingly worried for their personal safety.
Unfortunately, there are people here who assault others and try to steal things, cameras, wallets, passports. So we do feel less comfortable.
They pretend to be tourists taking pictures before they go up the Eiffel Tower. When they eventually get up, they find real tourists, get to their pockets and take their wallets.
Employees here say security concerns are making their job impossible. They're calling for more support from the authorities.
We're having to deal with organized networks. That's why we had to use our write-to-down tools, so we get our message heard, and so we can ask to have more police officers deployed.
Yet authorities say that pickpocketing is down by over 20% since the beginning of this year, as security has been boosted around the Eiffel Tower.
We've put in place additional resources. We've reinforced the security presence at the entrance, where we do the bag searches, where we have people who can spot members of the gangs, since we know they're often the same people, and then we remove them from the queue when we recognise them. The question is, are these measures enough to reassure the staff?
For now, employees have come to a temporary agreement with the management, but there are to be more detailed negotiations in the near future, with a view to better serving the 7 million people who visit the Eiffel Tower every year.
At the foot of the Eiffel Tower, Parisians and visitors are getting a taste of the French Open. Roland Garros is the world's biggest clay court tournament, but have you ever wondered where that red dirt comes from? Well, the charm and challenge of this Open is courtesy of the country's north in brick-making territory.
For some, it's a challenge. For others, it's an advantage. The French Open is the only Grand Slam tournament on clay court. But where does the red dirt come from? From these quarries near Lille in northern France. Here, limestone is mined, then baked in ovens and formed into bricks. About 3% of the 30,000 tons of bricks produced here every year ends up in a heap like this one in the factory's backyard, deemed unfit for industrial use.
These are mainly bricks with defects that don't meet the construction industry's quality standards, so we can't sell them to our clients.
Even if they can't be used to make houses, there is a market for them. Another factory near Paris buys up most of them. Here, the defective bricks spend a few more weeks under the sun and rain, and then dried. Workers here spend 8 hours a day passing the bricks through a grinder, and out comes crushed gravel in a familiar red colour. Roland Garros is the biggest client for this firm, but the prestigious tennis courts cannot be covered with just any clay.
The dirt must be very fine and must meet the specific conditions set out by Roland Garros.
It's a secret then?
Exactly.
Each court requires more than a ton of clay, which is spread at a depth of only 2 millimeters. Conditioning is all important for star players to be able to wow spectators with their sliding shots.
Well, it's game, set and match for this edition of France in Focus. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to France 24.